In 2023, a teenage boy vanished during his sunrise jog. 2 years later, a drone scanning an Iowa cornfield spots a heat signature that leads detectives into a hidden network of underground shelters, missing children, and the boy himself, who's been dismantling the operation from the inside. The drone rose silently into the pale morning sky, its rotors slicing through the dense Iowa fog that hung low over the Stillwater cornfields. From the ground, there was nothing to see but an endless curtain of gray mist stretching out in every direction. But through the drone's thermal lens, the world told a different story. Patches of residual heat glowed from the soil, scattered wildlife blinked in and out of frame, and then, deep within the maze of cornstalks, a shape appeared. At first, it was nothing but a smear of red-orange in the lower corner of the screen. Unmoving, humanoid, faint. The drone operator leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. Then, without warning, the figure shifted. Slowly, as if stiff or frightened, it crouched lower. It didn't run, it didn't vanish. It simply knelt and faded into the thermal fog, like something too tired to keep going. The footage was flagged immediately and sent to the county sheriff's office, who in turn forwarded it to Detective Cora Ames. She had seen more than her share of oddities over the years, but the second she watched the clip, her throat tightened, not because of what she saw, but because of who she thought it might be. 2 years earlier, 17-year-old Noah Blake had vanished from this very stretch of land. It was just past 6 in the morning when he left the house for his usual run. He wore a gray hoodie, dark shorts, and an old pair of cross-country shoes. He jogged along County Road 14, a gravel path surrounded by endless rows of corn and no sidewalks. It was his routine. He had done it 100 times before. That day, he never came home. Search teams covered the area for weeks. His phone had been found in the grass near a culvert, screen cracked, music still paused mid-track. No footprints, no drag marks, no clothing. Just the wind and the corn and the memory of a boy swallowed by silence. Now 2 years later, something had stirred in that same silence, and for the first time in a long while, the question wasn't whether Noah had vanished, it was whether he had ever truly left. The Blake house sat at the edge of Stillwater, past the last row of mailboxes, and just before the gravel dipped into farmland. It looked the same as it had 2 years earlier, except for the porch light that never turned off and the mailbox that hadn't held anything but flyers in weeks. Inside, the hallway remained untouched, the framed cross-country ribbons still hanging in the same order, the track shoes resting by the door where Noah had left them the day before he vanished. Mark Blake sat at the kitchen table, elbows on the wood, eyes fixed on a folded printout of the drone image. Elise stood behind him, silent, one hand on his shoulder, the other gripping a mug that had long gone cold. The sheriff had brought the photo early that morning and explained that while it wasn't confirmation, it was the first unexplained heat signature they had seen in that field since the search had ended. It wasn't wildlife. It wasn't machinery. It was human. At least, it had been for those brief, flickering seconds. Cora Ames arrived just after 9. She hadn't been back to the Blake house in almost a year. She'd stayed in touch, made the occasional call, but there had never been anything new to say. Now, for the first time, she walked in with something real. She asked them carefully if they recognized anything in the drone footage, the outline, the posture, the way the figure crouched down. Mark studied the frame with hollow eyes and said it looked like Noah. Not with certainty, not with hope. Just quiet belief, like a father recognizing a silhouette he hadn't stopped dreaming about. Elise reached into a drawer and pulled out an old running map. She unfolded it on the table beside the drone printout. Noah had marked his regular routes with different colors. The path he took the morning he disappeared was highlighted in blue. The drone's location ping, according to coordinates, sat right beside it. The silence that followed settled like a fog of its own. No one said what they were thinking, because it was too fragile to speak aloud. But for the first time in 2 years, the road ahead didn't feel like it ended in a question. It felt like it was finally leading somewhere. County Road 14 hadn't changed. The gravel still crunched the same beneath boots, the morning wind still whispered through the tall stalks, and the old wooden fence just past mile marker 3 still leaned at the same tired angle. It was here, at the bend where the road dipped between two narrow fields, that Noah's GPS signal had gone dead. Cora stepped out of her cruiser and stood quietly, scanning the landscape like it might suddenly offer up a piece of itself. 2 years ago, this had been the last place his digital footprint existed. The phone had been found near the culvert to her right, earbuds still connected, screen dark, battery drained. She crossed the road and crouched near the edge of the grass. The cornfield beyond it had been replanted twice since the search ended, but the land remembered things better than people did. She followed the path Noah likely took, his jogging route matching the narrow shoulder along the corn rows, and moved farther in until the road sound softened behind her. About 30 yards in, she stopped. A low break in the stalks caught her eye. Something unnatural. Not a deer path, not weather damage. It was subtle, but the ground had been pressed down in a way that suggested footsteps, not recent but repeated. She moved slowly, parting the stalks with both hands, until she saw it. There, tucked against the base of a tree that had grown taller than it had any right to in this part of the field, was a carving. 2 letters, NB, etched shallow but clear. Beneath them, the faint outline of a circle with a diagonal slash, a mark she'd seen once before in an old notebook Noah had kept during his sophomore year. His way of tagging things he thought were temporary. She radioed in her location, voice calm but alert. Then she reached down and brushed the soil beside the roots. Something caught the light, a shoelace, frayed and half-buried. Black with blue trim, still threaded through a rusted grommet. Cora stood up, eyes narrowing as the wind moved through the field around her. Whatever had happened to Noah hadn't ended here, but this was where something had started. The farmhouse sat a quarter-mile down from where Noah's GPS signal had died, a modest 2-story framed in white with weathered shutters and a leaning antenna mounted above the porch. Cora had been here once before, back during the first week of the search, when the entire town had been combed for witnesses. Back then, the owner, Richard Emmons, had been cooperative but forgetful, an aging farmer with failing hearing and a stiff walk. He'd said he didn't remember seeing anything unusual, just a morning like any other. But now, with the drone footage casting new light across old shadows, it was worth a second visit. When she knocked, it took him a while to answer. The screen door creaked open, and his eyes blinked up at her like he was still trying to place the day. She reintroduced herself, and his mouth tightened, that subtle way memory sometimes snapped into focus before it was fully welcome. She asked again about the morning Noah disappeared, and he said he still didn't think he'd seen anything. But then he paused, squinting toward the cornfields behind her. There was something he hadn't mentioned before. Not because he'd meant to keep it quiet, he said, but because it hadn't felt like anything at the time. Just noise. A voice, maybe. It came from the field behind the barn, around the same time he'd gone out to feed the animals. He couldn't make out words, just sharp bursts like someone yelling and then stopping. He'd assumed it was one of the neighbor kids cutting through the rows. They used to do that sometimes. He hadn't heard anything after that. Cora asked why he hadn't said anything during the initial interviews. He looked at her and said, "I didn't want to make something out of nothing." Then he added, "But if that boy's still out there, even a little something might matter now." She thanked him and walked the back lot herself, passing rusted equipment and empty feed bins. The field behind the barn stretched wide, tall with thick rows that looked the same as every other in Stillwater until the breeze shifted and revealed a path just barely pressed into the stalks. Like something or someone had come through and hadn't come back. The path through the corn wasn't obvious at first. It didn't run straight or wide like a trail made by deer or farmhands. It wove in shallow curves, pressed down just enough to show a body moving carefully through, low to the ground, slow and deliberate. Cora stepped between the rows, her boots flattening the dry earth beneath her, the leaves brushing her arms as the light thinned overhead. The sun was higher now, but in the density of the field, the world remained dim and close. She followed the trail deeper. The farther she moved, the more unnatural it felt. There were small breaks in the stalks where someone had paused, crouched maybe, or changed direction. Insects stirred, and the air grew heavier with the scent of soil and dust. About 50 feet in, the path abruptly widened. The corn bent outward in a rough oval, as if someone had stayed here for a long time. In the center, hidden beneath layers of leaves and dried husks, was an old tarp, flattened and stained. She knelt beside it and lifted a corner. Beneath it was nothing but earth, but the shape of the tarp suggested it had once covered more. A makeshift lean-to, maybe, or a bed. She looked around the space. Bits of dried fruit peels, a torn label from a granola bar, faint impressions in the dirt, like knees, hands. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. Someone had used this place. Not years ago, maybe weeks. Cora stood, scanning the rows beyond. This part of the field was tucked low, invisible from the road or the farmhouse. If someone had been hiding, or even living out here, they could have gone unnoticed for a long time. She pulled out her radio and marked the coordinates, requesting a small ground unit to help search the area around the tarp site. As she turned to retrace her steps, her foot caught on something partially buried near the base of a stalk. She reached down and pulled free a narrow, spiral-bound sketch pad, its cover worn and softened by time. The initials NB were etched faintly into the corner. Cora didn't open it yet. She just held it, heartbeat steady but quickening, and knew this field still had more to give. The sketchbook rested in Cora's lap as she sat on the edge of the cruiser's open tailgate, the cornfield rustling softly behind her like it was holding its breath. The pages were stiff from moisture, edges curled and frayed, but the binding held. She opened it slowly, half expecting to find nothing but blank paper or rain-warped doodles. Instead, what she saw made her still completely. The first page was a map, not printed, not labeled, hand-drawn from memory, in dark pencil with trembling lines. It showed a stretch of county road, the curve of a culvert, a square meant to be a barn, a dot for the farmhouse. Along the edges, rows and rows of parallel lines marked the cornfields. Some were shaded in. Others had small X's beside them. One circle was drawn in bold, pressed into the paper hard enough to indent the next page. The second page showed a face. Not detailed, not realistic, but sketched with intensity. A man with sharp eyes, a long nose, and a frown carved deep. The lines were heavy, the kind someone might draw again and again to make sure they wouldn't fade. Beneath it, in smaller handwriting, were the words, "He watches from the trees." She flipped through more pages. Some were simple drawings, trees, power lines, fences. Others were notes, timestamps, tallies in rows of 7. Scratchy words like "rain again," "heard something," "two birds," "need to wait." The entries grew less coherent the deeper she went, a mixture of observation and isolation. But one thing was clear. Noah had written these. Recently. One page held only a drawing of a house, 2 windows, a sagging roof, and a cracked sidewalk. But it wasn't just any house. Cora recognized it. It was the Blakes' home, viewed from the street. The perspective was exact. It wasn't a memory. It was something seen recently enough to be drawn with that kind of precision. She closed the sketchbook carefully, holding it like something fragile and alive. Noah hadn't just been out here. He'd been trying to leave a trail, 1 page at a time. And someone had either helped him survive or made sure he couldn't be found. Not until now. Cora stood at the edge of the field, the sketchbook clutched tightly in her hand as the drone team arrived to rescan the area. They launched 2 units this time, both equipped with enhanced thermal imaging and GPS tracking, and began sweeping grid patterns across the western rows of the property. The previous sighting had lasted only seconds, but the image had been clear, one human-shaped signature, crouched, still, then vanishing. The new flight would be faster, more focused. They weren't looking for coincidence anymore. They were looking for someone real. She briefed the pilots quickly and then returned to the farmhouse. Mr. Emmons met her at the door again, quieter this time. When she showed him the sketchbook and the map inside, he stared at the drawing for a long moment before nodding toward the edge of his property. There had been a structure out there years ago, he said. A storm shelter, poured concrete, half collapsed now and mostly forgotten. He'd covered it with scrap metal years back to keep animals out and hadn't thought about it since. She asked why he hadn't mentioned it during the original search. He shrugged uncomfortably and said it hadn't seemed important. The search team had focused on woods and ditches, assuming Noah had wandered or been taken far away. No one had asked about what was under the ground. With the sun dipping lower behind a veil of thin clouds, Cora walked out to where the old shelter supposedly sat. The ground was uneven, the corn thinned, and after several minutes of searching, she found it. A mound of earth hidden beneath two rusted panels, half swallowed by weeds. She pulled them back slowly, coughing against the sudden release of dust and mildew. A metal hatch, worn with age, was set into the dirt. It had no lock, just a heavy ring welded to the top. She called for backup before touching it. The air around her felt too still, the kind of stillness that carries watching eyes. When the others arrived, they pried the hatch open together, hinges groaning with years of rust. The opening below led into darkness. It was shallow, maybe 10 feet, with cold air rising up like breath from a cave, a ladder, damp earth, and far below, the faint shape of a blanket curled against the wall. Something or someone had been living down there. The air inside the shelter was thick with moisture and the metallic scent of old concrete. Cora descended the ladder slowly, her flashlight casting pale beams along the curved walls. The space was cramped, maybe the size of a garden shed, with low ceilings and packed dirt underfoot. The farther down she climbed, the clearer it became that this hadn't just been used, it had been lived in. A thin mattress lay along one side, its fabric stained and frayed at the edges. Next to it, a stack of empty soup cans, arranged in rows as if counted again and again. A plastic crate held a flashlight with dead batteries, a spiral notebook filled with numbers and slashes, and a cracked mirror with a name etched faintly on the back, Noah. She crouched beside the crate and flipped through the notebook. Each page was dated in scrawled handwriting, though the dates often repeated, the months sometimes out of order. Most entries were just marks, patterns of tallies, lines crossed in clusters of 7, like a calendar scratched into time. Some pages had single words: cold, thunder, wait, watch. Along the far wall, someone had drawn in charcoal rough sketches of trees, a windmill, and what looked like the outline of a man holding something long in his arms. A stick? A rifle? The shape was just vague enough to be both. Cora stood and ran her fingers along the low ceiling. There were scrape marks, a patch of fabric pinned with rusted nails. Above it, something clinked, a string of soda tabs knotted with twine like a rudimentary alarm. Whoever had lived here hadn't just been hiding, they'd been trying to protect themselves. Or keep something else out. She radioed to the team above, instructing them to photograph everything before removing it. She didn't want this space disturbed more than necessary, because every object told a story. The cans, the mirror, the notebook. They weren't just remnants of survival. They were evidence of isolation, of control, of someone down here trying to mark the days until escape. Cora looked once more toward the mattress, then back to the hatch above. If Noah had been here, then someone had helped put him here. And that person wasn't finished watching. Not yet. The sun had begun to sink behind the rows of corn as Cora stepped out of the shelter, her boots damp from the floor below, her mind racing faster than she could manage. The discovery confirmed what many had feared and some had quietly suspected. Noah Blake hadn't run away. He hadn't gotten lost. He had been kept somewhere beneath the surface of the land people drove past every day without a second glance. Back at the farmhouse, the sheriff reviewed the items pulled from the shelter one by one. Most were exactly what Cora had seen: scavenged food containers, faded notebooks, handmade tools, and crude drawings. But there was one thing tucked beneath the mattress that changed everything. A disposable camera, weathered but intact. Its film roll had been advanced nearly all the way, and there were visible smudges across the lens. It had been hidden carefully, wrapped in 2 socks and shoved into the corner where the wall met dirt. Someone hadn't wanted it found easily. Cora held it with gloved hands, her breath catching in her throat. The camera would need to be processed carefully, but if it worked, if the film hadn't degraded, this could offer a visual record of Noah's time underground. Or even something or someone responsible for putting him there. That night, she returned to the Blake house. Mark and Elise answered the door before she even knocked, their expressions locked in a strange place between dread and relief. Cora didn't give them details yet, just said they had found something significant and that for the first time in 2 years they were no longer working from guesswork. She held up the sketchbook and the camera gently, like relics from another world. Mark blinked back emotion, eyes fixed on the notebook's cover. Elise reached for the camera but stopped just short of touching it. "He had one like that," she said softly. "He used to take pictures of trees, clouds, his shoelaces. Said he wanted to remember ordinary things just in case." Cora nodded, but said nothing else. Some pieces were better left quiet until they could speak for themselves. But deep down, she already knew. If the pictures inside that camera developed clearly, they would show more than ordinary things. They might reveal who had stolen 2 years of a boy's life and why. The photolab technician called just after noon, her voice tight and careful, like she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to say what she was about to. The film had developed, mostly. A few frames were damaged beyond recovery, exposed, overlit, or blurred from age, but the rest were intact. The sheriff's office cleared a quiet room in the back, lights dimmed, and Cora sat alone with the prints as they arrived. Each image was like a message from a place no one should have had to live in, a breadcrumb trail across days and nights that had passed without witness. The first few were simple. Shots of the shelter's interior, the ladder from below, the cracked ceiling, food tins lined like soldiers along the wall. Then came the self-portraits, Noah's reflection in the mirror. Hair longer, face hollowed, eyes still focused. He documented himself without vanity, a record more than a cry for help. But something shifted halfway through. The angles changed, the lighting dimmed. He began photographing the hatch at night, then again at sunrise, like he was trying to prove time was still moving. The last 4 images turned everything. One showed a figure outside the hatch, only half visible through the cracked door. A leg, a boot, heavy tread, and mud-caked. The next was darker, shot through the shelter's upper grating. Someone was standing at the edge of the field, backlit by morning fog, male, broad-shouldered. The third photo captured the man's face unfocused, but close enough to stir recognition. Gray stubble. Deep frown lines. The same eyes sketched in the notebook. The same outline described years ago by a gas station clerk who thought she'd seen a stranger talking to Noah the week before he vanished. The final image was the most chilling. Taken from low to the ground, just outside the shelter, it showed Noah's foot mid-step, one shoelace untied, dirt clinging to the rubber sole, and behind it, emerging from the corn, was the man's hand reaching forward. Cora stared at the pictures long after the technician had stepped out. Each photo didn't just confirm Noah's captivity, they confirmed he had found a way to resist it. He had planned something. He had known someone would come eventually. And he had left these behind so the truth could follow him, even if he couldn't make it out himself. Cora stared at the grainy print, the man's outstretched hand frozen in motion just behind Noah's foot. The image was unsteady, slightly blurred, but its message rang louder than anything spoken. Noah hadn't just been surviving, he'd been trying to escape, and whoever had kept him there knew it. She ran the photo through facial recognition software, cross-referenced it with known offenders in the region, but the system came back blank, no match. Either the man had never been arrested, or he had somehow slipped through the cracks. She met with the sheriff that afternoon, laying out the prints one by one across the war room table. The team clustered around in silence, eyes fixed on the images, each telling a chapter no one wanted to believe. When she reached the final photo, the room grew heavier. Someone muttered, "That's close." Close enough that if Noah hadn't moved faster, hadn't hidden the camera, the story might have ended right there. The sheriff pointed to the boot. "That tread's deep-lugged, farm-style, looks like a Red Wing or Danner. Not something you get at a chain store." They started pulling purchase records from local suppliers, looking for transactions involving large sizes, anything to narrow the list. Meanwhile, Cora returned to the cornfield. She stood again at the spot where the hatch had been hidden and followed the direction Noah's foot had pointed in that photo. Past the edge of the field, across a small ditch, the land dipped into a grove of cedar and scrub pine. It was a forgotten pocket of land, shielded by elevation and overgrowth. Within 100 yards, she found tire tracks embedded into soft earth, leading up to a hunting blind constructed from plywood and tarps. It wasn't listed on any of the property maps. Inside, she found an old thermos, recent food wrappers, and a pair of binoculars. But what stopped her was the ash. In the center of the blind was a burn ring, still faintly warm, and beside it a melted plastic sleeve that once held photographs. Someone had been watching that field. Someone had seen the search ramp up and started covering their tracks. If Noah had gotten away, the man was still out there, and he wasn't finished running. The wind had picked up by evening, dragging the scent of burned plastic from the hunting blind into the trees. Cora stood just beyond the burn ring, her eyes scanning the surrounding terrain for movement. She knew better than to assume the blind had been abandoned for long. The thermos was still half full, the ash still warm. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry. She radioed the sheriff and requested a forensic team and a drone sweep of the woods. As she waited, she crouched by the charred remains of the photo sleeve and gently sifted through the ash with a gloved hand. Most of it had been reduced to blackened curls, but one corner hadn't burned completely. The glossy edge of a photo remained intact, just enough to make out a patch of blue sky and a rooftop. She slipped it into an evidence bag and zipped it tight. When the forensics team arrived, they moved carefully through the blind, cataloging every footprint and disturbance. A cast of the tire tracks was taken, and a boot print was found leading away from the site toward the tree line. Not far from there, partially hidden under a log, was a backpack. Inside were clothes, a pocket knife, a map of the county with markings in red ink, and a small plastic bottle filled with prescription pills, painkillers, long expired, prescribed to a name that didn't match any local records. The name on the bottle was Jack Avery. Cora took the label and ran it through databases, both local and federal, but came up with no recent address. Nothing linked him to the region. But when she cross-checked the name with old high school yearbooks from the 1970s, a photo surfaced. A younger man, clean-shaven, but with that same sharp chin and narrow eyes. Jack Avery had lived in the next county over, had vanished from employment records around 1982, and hadn't had a fixed residence since. There were no arrests, but whispers of trespassing and loitering in rural areas were scattered through old police reports. She stared at his yearbook photo and then back at the burned blind. He wasn't some drifter who happened upon Noah. He knew these woods. He knew where to hide. And now that they were closing in, she was certain he knew exactly where to run next. Cora sat in the dim office of the sheriff's department late into the night, flipping through faded photocopies and scribbled notes. Jack Avery's name didn't appear on any major wanted lists, but there was a quiet trail of unease behind him. A transient, a loner, always one step ahead of any real scrutiny. He'd held a job repairing barns in the late 80s, been questioned once after a boy reported being followed home from a fishing spot, but nothing had ever stuck. No charges, no convictions, just whispers in the margins of forgotten reports. What troubled her most wasn't just his sudden appearance in this case, but the calculated way he'd stayed invisible. The hunting blind hadn't been thrown together in desperation, it had been built with care. Reinforced walls, hidden supply caches, even camouflaged paths through the brush. This was someone who had planned to stay unseen, and someone who didn't want Noah's story told. The team worked overnight to cross-reference the map found in the backpack. Most of the red markings matched utility trails and forgotten properties, many of them old hunting leases or unused farmland. But one stood out. A small square near an old grain elevator, long defunct, that had never come up during their previous search. The building had been condemned years ago and partially collapsed, but it was close enough to the cornfield to matter. At first light, Cora and a small unit moved in quietly. No sirens, no announcements. The building sagged under its own weight, metal siding peeled back like rusted skin. Inside, shafts of light streamed through holes in the roof, dust swirling in thick columns. They found more signs of recent use footprints in the dirt, a cot pushed into the corner, and torn blankets that still held body heat. In the far back corner, behind a stack of broken pallets, they found something else. Scratched into the metal wall with a nail or key were 4 words. "He's not alone anymore." The message sent a chill through Cora that didn't fade as she stepped back into the morning light. This wasn't just about one boy or one captor. It was starting to look like Noah wasn't the only one who had been taken, and Jack Avery might not be working alone. The grain elevator stood in eerie silence after the team cleared out, its rusted skeleton creaking faintly in the breeze. Cora remained behind, tracing her flashlight along the walls where the words had been etched. "He's not alone anymore." The phrase rattled in her head like a riddle that refused to settle. She photographed the writing, then moved slowly through the rest of the structure, careful not to step on anything that could erase evidence. Behind a pile of rotted grain sacks, tucked into a crevice between concrete and sheet metal, she found another notebook. This one was thinner than the one from the shelter, but just as intentional. It was wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, sealed tight with duct tape. She peeled it open on the hood of her cruiser, the sheriff leaning over her shoulder as she turned the first page. Inside were entries that began 2 years ago and ran up to what looked like only a few weeks prior. The handwriting matched Noah's. Some entries were short, nearly coded, "Rain again. He watched from the shed. Someone else screamed last night." Other pages were filled with more detail, revealing an agonizing map of captivity. One passage described a nearby structure with "pipes under the ground" and "the girl with the limp who doesn't talk." Cora's stomach twisted. There had been no reports of missing girls in the county that matched that description in the past year, but she knew from experience that not all cases made the news. Some families never reported. Some victims were never missed publicly. They sent drones back over the surrounding acreage, this time focusing on utility outbuildings and structures with visible piping or basements. One such location stood just over the county line, an abandoned septic treatment site surrounded by rusted fencing and a collapsed sign warning of chemical runoff. The entrance had been overgrown for years, and no one had reason to check it. Until now. Cora pressed her radio and gave the order to prepare for a breach. This wasn't just a case of one boy lost and found, it was evolving into something deeper, darker, and more deliberate. And if Noah had written that message, if he had seen another child inside that nightmare, then time was already running out for someone else. The old septic treatment site sat behind a curtain of tangled vines and rusted wire fencing, the kind of place people passed without noticing, its danger hidden in plain sight. As Cora and the search team approached, the air grew heavier with the scent of damp concrete and something acrid beneath it, like mold clinging to memory. The main structure, a long, windowless building with a slanted roof, had partially caved in at one end. Still, the doors were intact, chained shut but recently disturbed. The links hung loose, one clasp broken clean through, as if cut with bolt cutters. The team entered quietly, flashlights sweeping across stained walls and broken equipment. A heavy silence pressed down as they moved through narrow corridors, the only sound the crackle of their radios and the soft drip of water echoing from deeper within. The building's layout was a maze of concrete tanks and rooms long gutted of their original purpose. In the largest chamber, beneath what once was the chemical processing area, they found a hidden panel in the floor. Fresh scratches marked the concrete near the edge, and a trail of disturbed dust led directly to it. They pried it open slowly. Beneath, a steel ladder descended into darkness. The space below wasn't just a cellar, it was a modified bunker, reinforced with cinder blocks and old metal sheeting. As Cora stepped down, the temperature dropped. A dim light flickered from a battery-powered lantern hung on a hook, casting long shadows across the room. On the far wall were 3 makeshift beds, one of them still warm. Beside it sat a half-empty water bottle and a plastic doll missing one arm. Then came the sound, a muffled movement from the far corner behind a tarp nailed to the wall. Cora signaled the others and moved in. Pulling the tarp aside revealed a girl, no older than 12, curled in the corner, eyes wide with terror. She didn't speak, just stared through them like they were ghosts. Her leg bore the signs of an old injury, a limp, likely permanent. The girl wasn't Noah. She wasn't even listed in any current missing persons database. But she was real. She had been held here, hidden beneath a town that never thought to look. And now, because of Noah's notes and the photo trail he left behind, she wasn't alone anymore. The girl didn't speak for hours. She sat wrapped in a thermal blanket on the back of the ambulance, silent and blinking against the flood of daylight like it stung her. Paramedics gently cleaned the scrapes on her knees and measured vitals, but she flinched at every sound and avoided every eye. Cora stayed nearby, watching from a distance at first, then kneeling slowly beside her when the others stepped away. She offered the girl a juice box and waited in the kind of stillness that required no questions. After several long minutes, the girl took it with shaking hands and whispered her name, Emily. No last name, no address, but it was a start. She didn't know where she'd come from exactly, only that she had been there a long time, and that he brought other kids too. She spoke about the man in fragments, gray hair, old boots, the smell of fuel and something bitter on his clothes. Sometimes there was another man, taller, but she never saw his face, just his voice through the hatch or his boots at the top of the stairs. Cora recorded everything carefully. The girl mentioned a sound too, something loud that happened every few days, like a train or heavy machinery nearby. That detail narrowed the map. There was only one stretch of working rail line that passed close enough to match the description, and one old silo on county property that hadn't been inspected in years. As the team regrouped and rerouted their efforts, a call came in from a neighboring department. A man had been spotted walking a drainage canal 3 miles west of the cornfield, limping and carrying a backpack. He matched the rough description they'd been building of Jack Avery. When approached, he slipped into the trees and vanished, before the deputy could cut him off. It was the first confirmed sighting since the shelter was discovered. He was close, still hiding. And now, possibly desperate, Cora felt the shift in her gut. The search was no longer a question of whether Noah had survived. It was about how many others he'd risked everything to help. The quiet boy who disappeared on a jog may have been the only one who knew the full extent of what had happened and who had yet to be found. They brought in tracking dogs by dusk, following the report from the deputy who'd seen the man slip into the woods. The trail was faint, muddied by underbrush and last night's rain, but the dogs caught a direction and the team pressed deeper into the ravine. Cora moved quietly alongside them, flashlight low, eyes scanning for broken branches or discarded items. Jack Avery wasn't just on the run now, he was cornered, and that made him dangerous. Half a mile in, the dogs stopped at a collapsed drainage tunnel. The opening was tight, just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Inside, the air smelled of wet stone and rot. They found signs someone had crawled through, recently fresh scrapes on the concrete, boot prints still damp. At the far end, the tunnel led out behind an abandoned hunting lodge, one that had been closed for years after a fire left it structurally unstable. The county had sealed it off with boards and warning signs, but those had long since been pried loose. They surrounded the structure, moving in cautiously. Inside, the air was thick with mildew. Most of the second floor had caved in, but the basement remained intact. They descended slowly, flashlights cutting through the dark. What they found wasn't a hideout, it was a drop point. Old bags of supplies, empty jugs of water, and a wall covered in hand-drawn maps of the surrounding area. Each map was marked with numbers and initials. Some were circled, some crossed out. In the center was a Polaroid. It showed Noah pale, thinner, but unmistakably him standing beside a girl who appeared to be no older than 9. Both looked directly at the camera, and neither was smiling. The photo was taped to the wall with a note scrawled beneath it in thick black ink. "Still out there." Cora stepped back, her breath catching. It wasn't just evidence, it was a message. Whether from Avery or someone else, it meant the chase wasn't over. Noah had survived long enough to leave a trail. And if this photo was recent, if it had been placed here deliberately, then it meant he wanted to be found. He was still leading them, just not from the surface. Not yet. By the time they secured the hunting lodge and cataloged its contents, night had fully settled over the valley. The photo of Noah and the little girl was sent to nearby stations, and a team began combing through missing persons files for a match. But Cora couldn't sleep. She sat alone in her office with the photo propped against her desk lamp, staring at the children's expressions. Noah looked older than he should have. His jawline was sharper, and his eyes, once soft in the yearbook picture pinned to her corkboard, were now shadowed with something harder. Something that didn't belong in a teenage boy's face. The girl beside him was unfamiliar, but Cora couldn't shake the feeling she'd seen her before. She dug through records, scanning archived footage and posters until her eyes burned. Just past midnight, she found a name. Marissa Lane, reported missing from a neighboring county 14 months earlier. Foster system, few connections, her file had gone quiet within weeks. But now, her photo aged, grainy, matched the child standing next to Noah in that basement snapshot. The note scrawled beneath them, "Still out there," haunted every thought. Whoever had placed it knew they were getting close. Maybe Avery, maybe not. But someone was guiding this. Not just reacting planning. And it raised another question: why leave the photo behind at all? Why risk exposure unless it served a purpose? Cora returned to the lodge at dawn and retraced the team's steps, her boots crunching over broken glass and damp leaves. She stood where the Polaroid had hung and examined the wall more closely. Behind the map layers and taped notes, she noticed something else: scratches, nearly invisible at first, carved into the wood paneling. She scraped back a layer of old glue and uncovered more writing, etched deeply but carefully. It wasn't a warning. It was a list of initials, dozens of them. Some were familiar Noah's, now Marissa's. Others weren't in any database yet. Some may have never been reported missing at all. Cora stepped back and let the silence close in around her. This wasn't the work of one man. It was a system, hidden, silent, and far older than anyone realized. And Noah, somehow, was still fighting from the inside. Cora didn't leave the hunting lodge until the sun was high, casting broken beams through the shattered windows and lighting the dust that drifted in the air like ash. The list of initials carved behind the map stayed with her, every letter a name, every groove in the wood a missing life. Some had dates beside them, others question marks. One set, marked NL, had 3 lines underneath it. Noah Lake. She didn't know what the lines meant yet, but her gut told her they mattered. Back at the sheriff's office, the list was copied and cross-checked. Some of the initials matched known cases from across 3 counties. Others didn't match anything. It was as if they'd been forgotten before they'd even been searched for. Cora sat with Detective Sandoval, who had driven in from Newton after the lodge was secured, and together they traced the dots on a massive map pinned to the back wall. The pattern was there, faint but undeniable. Every location marked every place with a sighting, every child recovered or mentioned formed a slow, spiraling route east. Whoever was orchestrating this wasn't just hiding victims, they were moving them. They called in state resources. The case now had too many layers, too much territory. A special task force was being assembled, but bureaucracy moved slow. Cora couldn't wait. She returned to the shelter under the grain elevator, hoping for something they'd missed, something small that might break things open. This time, she brought a forensic analyst and a magnetometer crew. Beneath one of the old bunks, wedged in the concrete groove near a rusted floorbolt, the analyst found a chip of plastic no larger than a thumbnail. It looked like nothing until cleaned, then they saw it was a piece of a school ID badge. The printing was warped from moisture, but one letter survived, N. It wasn't proof, not yet. But it was enough for Cora. Noah had been here. He'd left pieces of himself behind in places where someone might find them. Not by accident, but by design. Every clue he'd left, every map, every scribbled word, it was all part of something bigger. He wasn't just surviving, he was leading them somewhere. And they had no choice now but to follow. The storm rolled in just after sunset, thick clouds swallowing the last light as thunder cracked across the fields. Cora stood under the overhang outside the sheriff's office, radio pressed to her ear, listening to the search teams call in updates as they scoured a new site east of the grain elevator. It was an abandoned orchard, long since left to the wild, overgrown with blackberry brambles and saplings. Aerial maps showed a faint trail cutting through the trees, one that hadn't appeared on earlier satellite scans. It was fresh, recent, and too deliberate to be wildlife. She drove out alone, headlights bouncing along the narrow dirt road that curled toward the orchard. Rain was falling by the time she arrived, soaking through her jacket as she stepped out, flashlight already drawn. The orchard was still, every branch dripped, every leaf trembling. She followed the faint path, ducking under limbs and pushing through wet underbrush until she saw it. A small wooden shed, sunken at one corner and camouflaged by vines. It didn't look like part of the original property, it looked temporary, like it had been dragged here or built fast. Cora approached slowly, boots sinking into mud, her light cutting through the slats in the walls. The door creaked open on one hinge and the smell hit her first: mildew, old blankets, and something faintly chemical. Inside, the space was cramped and dark, lit only by a single battery lantern on the floor. But what caught her breath was what hung on the back wall. Photos, dozens of them. Clipped to a twine line, stretched from one end of the shed to the other. Some were grainy Polaroids. Others looked like they were printed from a stolen phone. But in all of them, Noah was there, sometimes barely in frame, sometimes front and center. Always older than the last. Some showed him helping younger kids, others watching from a distance as someone led them away. In one, he held a flashlight, the beam pointed directly at the camera, like he'd known it was there. Pinned beneath the lantern was another note, smudged but legible. It read, "Too close now. Next stop is the barn. If I don't make it, look for the brand." Cora felt her pulse quicken. Noah wasn't running, he was signaling, and he'd just drawn the map to their next move. The barn wasn't on any official map, not under that name. But after hours combing through zoning records, agricultural permits, and utility filings from decades past, they found it listed under a defunct shell company dissolved in the early 90s. Its coordinates placed it nearly 4 miles from the orchard, tucked between soybean fields and flanked by a dry creek bed. Cora took one look at the satellite view and felt her chest tighten. The building was huge. No neighbors, no direct roads, and surrounded on all sides by thick tree lines that would shield it from view year-round. She didn't wait for backup. With Sandoval riding shotgun, they approached just before dawn, headlights off and windows cracked to catch the sounds of the morning. Fog still clung low to the soil, rising like steam around the tires as the gravel thinned and gave way to dirt. The barn came into view slowly, hulking and silent, its roof sagging slightly but intact. A rusted gate leaned against the side, and the front doors were chained with a lock that looked recently replaced. They parked behind the tree line and approached on foot, Cora's boots pressed softly into the dew-soaked earth. Every step forward felt louder than it should have been. At the side of the barn, they found an old vent window pushed open from the inside. A narrow gap, just wide enough for someone small to slip through. She crouched and peered in. A faint light flickered inside. Not daylight, something electric. There was power running. She turned to Sandoval and nodded. "We go in now. Quiet." They entered through the side and stepped into stale, humid air. The interior smelled like hay and rust and something faintly antiseptic. Along one wall stood empty animal pens, long unused. But further back, behind a curtain of hanging plastic sheeting, the scene changed. Metal tables, shelves with neatly stacked blankets, bottles of water, energy bars, flashlights, radios, medical kits. And in the far corner, a cot with a note pinned to the frame. It was written in the same hand as before. "One left. He knows I'm close. If you're reading this, keep going. Don't stop now." Noah had been here. Recently. He was alive. And he was counting on them to reach him before the last door closed. The cot was still warm. Cora pressed the back of her hand to the thin, quilted blanket and felt the residual heat of a body that had only recently left. Her eyes swept the room again, this time not just cataloging supplies, but reading them like breadcrumbs. There were muddy boot prints on the concrete floor, still wet from the outside, leading toward the rear of the barn, where a heavy tarp had been nailed to the wall. Behind it, they found a door, not an exterior exit, but one leading down. A staircase, steep and narrow, vanished into a cellar lined with cinder block. The walls were unpainted, the air growing colder with each step, the hum of a generator somewhere below vibrating faintly in the bones of the building. Sandoval moved ahead, weapon drawn, while Cora kept her light trained low. The basement wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. In the corner sat an old file cabinet, its drawers warped and rusted. Taped along the side were names, dozens of them, real names, full ones this time, not just initials. Some had check marks beside them, others had question marks, and a handful, 3 to be exact, were underlined in red. Noah Lake was one of them. Beneath the list was a sealed box, plastic and wrapped with bungee cords. Cora knelt, undid them, and lifted the lid. Inside were IDs, keys, notebooks, old photos, and flash drives labeled by year. It was evidence. Not just of who had been taken, but of who had taken them. In the corner of one Polaroid, someone had scrawled the name Avery, along with an address. Cora's breath caught. She looked at Sandoval, who was already dialing in the coordinates. "This address. It's not far. 10 miles. Maybe less. We've got him." The radio crackled to life as another unit, scanning infrared just south of the barn, reported movement 2 figures, one larger than the other, cutting across the soybean field. The signature matched a teenage male and a smaller child. They were moving fast, but not running, not hiding. Noah was leading again. And if they moved now, they might finally reach him before he vanished once more into the fog. The road to the Avery residence was little more than a tractor path, winding between low hills and abandoned silos, barely wide enough for a patrol vehicle. It was the kind of place that didn't show up on tourist maps and hadn't seen a stranger in years. As they neared the property, a drone team hovering overhead confirmed 2 heat signatures entering the back of the house, one tall, one small, just minutes earlier. Cora's foot pressed harder on the gas. Every second counted now. They pulled up without lights, dust curling in the pre-dawn air as the SUV came to a stop beneath a cluster of leaning trees. The house looked lifeless from the front, just a 2-story farmhouse with rotted shutters and a mailbox full of mold, but the back door was ajar, its frame splintered at the latch. Noah had either broken in or forced someone out. Inside, the air smelled like motor oil and mildew. The floors groaned beneath every step. Cora led the way, flashlight scanning low, weapon drawn, ears tuned to the faintest sound. In the living room, a map was spread across a folding table, weighed down by a hammer and a half-drunk bottle of water. Red circles dotted the counties west of here, markings eerily similar to the ones Noah had drawn. This wasn't just a hideout, it had been used to plan. A floorboard creaked above them. Cora and Sandoval moved quickly up the staircase, the wood sagging under their weight. At the end of the narrow hall, a bedroom door stood slightly open. She pushed it gently. Inside, a boy sat on the edge of the bed, blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He looked about 8, filthy, shaken, but alive. Standing just beyond him, near the window, was Noah. He turned at the sound of the door and blinked against the beam of Cora's flashlight. He looked older than 17 now, thinner, paler, but his eyes were clear, determined. And when he spoke, his voice was calm. "He's gone. He ran out the back when he saw the drone, but he'll be back. He always comes back." Cora stepped into the room, her voice low. "We're not leaving this time. We're ending it." Noah just nodded. "Then you're going to need the basement." The basement door groaned as it opened, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air shifted, thick with damp earth and motor oil. Cora led the way down, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, Sandoval close behind with his hand on his sidearm. At the bottom, concrete walls loomed with no windows and only a single bulb dangling from a wire above. It flickered once, then held steady, casting a sickly yellow light across the room. Against one wall stood shelves lined with jugs of water, protein bars, and sealed boxes. But it wasn't the supplies that stopped them cold, it was the evidence wall. Photographs, documents, maps, all meticulously arranged. There were intake sheets with names and birth dates, checklists, a calendar with codes scrawled in red ink. And in the center, taped to a faded corkboard, was a Polaroid of Noah from nearly a year ago. In it, he was standing behind the very same boy, now resting upstairs, one hand on the child's shoulder, eyes locked on the camera, as if daring someone to come find them. Noah's voice broke the silence. He kept records on everything, who took what, where they were sent, codes tied to shipping dates. It's all here. Cora turned to him. "How long were you undercover?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed the room and picked up a flash drive from a metal tray. "Since the month after I disappeared, I knew if I ran they'd find me again, but if I stayed, I could start tearing it down from the inside." Cora took the drive gently, her heart pounding. This was more than a recovery. It was a takedown in the making. A network they hadn't even known existed, now with names, logistics, and location data. She stepped back, pulling her radio to call in a full response team, while Sandoval began photographing everything in sight. Above them, the sound of a second vehicle pulling into the drive echoed faintly. Then a voice, not frantic, not angry, calm, too calm. "Noah, you shouldn't have brought them here." But this time, Noah didn't flinch. He stepped toward the stairs, eyes locked on the man who had haunted him for 2 years. "I didn't bring them," he said. "I led them."